welcome. It's a
Thank
pleasure to
you.
have you. So I'm interested in speaking about your first book, about the complexity of what it means to talk about even just evangelicals as a term. You note in your own words, quote, that is a controversial and often ill-defined sociological term. And in response, you offer your own experience as an illustration, often saying how you never described yourself as evangelical until you left the movement in many cases. In your reporting on Christian communities across the US, you've met people who do self-identify as evangelical, others who fit the academic definition, but who don't identify as evangelical, and also a wide range of emerging alternative terms and definitions. What tensions do you see around how people identify with or against evangelicalism? And what working definition of that term have you found most useful in your work?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I'm asked a lot because I think there's a tendency sometimes for people, at least in my observation, to sort of label everything they don't like as evangelical, if that's how they're inclined, or the way that I experienced it, to sort of define ourselves as evangelical over against fundamentalism. And the history of fundamentalism and evangelicalism, I will leave to historians, but in essence, there's a lot of overlap, and in many ways, evangelicalism sort of grew out of and in response to fundamentalism. But in my experience in the evangelical world, and I attended a college that had the word evangelical in the title, so at least in that case, we were self-identifying as evangelical. The basic beliefs were the same. They were, a literal view of Scripture, a view of Jesus as the only way to God, this belief that it was imperative and really our purpose on the earth as Christians to spread our beliefs to people, to non-believers. And in many cases, that became a political project as well, or had political implications. So yes, it's a theological term. It's in some cases become a political, sociological term. And it's one that, pollsters have wrestled with in different ways, sometimes using the term born again, which is maybe a way that, especially when I was a young child in the 80s, that's a term I would have heard a lot more in my church or in my community than evangelical. But in my experience, most evangelicals just call themselves Christians, and they might tell you that they're part of a specific church or even a specific denomination, but they'd say that they believe in the Bible and they believe in Jesus, and in many cases, they want to share that with other people. So, the tensions are really kind of internal. Like, what do you see evangelical as a positive term? Is it sort of positive, preferable to another word, or is it seen as sort of a catch-all label for what you don't like or disagree with? And the answer kind of depends on the person, but the working definition that I've gone with is really kind of simple: just theologically conservative Protestants who are committed to generally a literal view of the Bible, and again, a belief in the centrality of salvation through Jesus Christ, and a belief in the importance of spreading that message.
Yeah. And that work of, I think, self-definition really then seeps into your work in this book of what it means to be ex-evangelical. And, your book focuses on the experiences of those who have left the church and choose to use, in some cases, the term ex-evangelical, or in many cases, do not. This term that largely emerged in online spaces, you note how it is being contested as well, with many people preferring to no longer even be loosely identified with evangelicalism. Based on your reporting, how would you map the different orientations and subgroups within the broader collective you're identifying as ex-evangelical?
Right. So the term ex-evangelical, it appears to have emerged as a hashtag on social media, primarily Twitter, around the summer of 2016. Blake Chastain, who is a podcaster and writer, is credited with creating that hashtag. And, a lot of the conversation early on surrounded the rise of Donald Trump, but it was about much more than just Trump. And I think it was sort of a succinct way of expressing what I think many people certainly people who've read the book tell me, and what I experienced, which is the reality that growing up evangelical, or in one of the adjacent movements, however you define that, it really is sort of like growing up in a culture, a subculture with its own media and its own institutions, and in many ways its own language. I don't mean language like English or Spanish, but its own metaphors and ideas and sort of accepted memes in a way. And to have emerged from that and in some way moved away from it is to have kind of a common experience. And, I found as I was paying attention to this hashtag, and then of course the algorithm feeds you all kinds of related content, I was also running across this word deconstruction, which was being sort of employed to describe the process of rethinking one's religious beliefs. And I was seeing a lot of similar parallel themes, conversations around politics, yes, but also theology, in terms of the afterlife, in terms of inclusion or how to think about non-Christian faiths, and certainly sexuality and science and many other themes. And so I started kind of, over time paying attention to these conversations and then reaching out to people who most of them were using the Evangelical hashtag, but I also reached out to some people in my life who I felt fit that definition, had been evangelical and no longer, totally fit that profile. Some are progressive Christians today, some are not Christians. There are, there's another book out there called, I don't recall the author's name, but called The Other Evangelicals, which sort of breaks down, non-white evangelicals, LGBTQ evangelicals, people who've come up in that world and for whatever reason don't fit into sort of the, traditional patriarchal, heterosexual, and primarily white framework that is dominant in evangelicalism.
You bring up that term deconstruction, and I think that's a really key term to understanding this movement. Throughout your book, you instead use the term unraveling to describe what it feels like when an evangelical begins questioning their own beliefs. Others have favored the term deconstruction to describe the process of rebuilding their faith, but you use the metaphor of a rope, where each individual belief is a strand wound around others. As you unravel one strand, others that felt more stable may begin to come undone as well. As you have observed different groups and people undergo their own unravelings, what are the things that lead people to begin that process? And are there people for whom that process becomes too much and so abandon it?
Well, I would say I find both of those terms useful, and both of them I sort of borrow from other people who've been through the process. I think the reason, I'm not opposed to the term deconstruction, but the reason it isn't sort of a primary term that I've used is that this language didn't exist when I was in my early 20s, in the early 2000s, really kind of just out of college and trying to figure out what I believed and how I wanted to form my own family and how I wanted to live my life. And so it was interesting and in a way validating to discover that there is kind of a language that's grown up around it. But specifically, unraveling was a word that I think I heard it from a couple of people, but I think the one that stands out to me is Stephanie Stalvey, who is an artist in Florida who I ran across on Instagram. She was making these beautiful kind of comic style drawings about her deconstruction experience. And I think she might have been using the hashtag Evangelical as well. But as I was starting my research, I found her and found her drawings really resonant and moving. They portrayed situations, some of which I describe in the book, that almost identical situations that I had been in, about encountering people of different belief systems and so forth, and feeling pressure to, witness or share the gospel, as we call it. But she, in our conversation, in our interview for the book, used the term unraveling and said it really felt like an unraveling for her, and like pieces were sort of fraying. And I thought that was a really apt metaphor because there are lots of different threads. And, I sort of organized the book around these themes of almost, you could call them threads, that kept coming up again and again. Each of them, or most of them, I'd experienced in my own life, either personally or through people that I knew. And I also was seeing lots of conversation around them. So again, things like the view of science, the view of secular authority and knowledge, sexuality, whether that's purity culture or LGBTQ experiences for people who are LGBTQ, but I think for most evangelical teens who grew up, at the height of purity culture in the 1990s, that meant all kinds of things for how you thought about romance and marriage and relationships and dating and also the body. and certainly politics. You can't escape the politics. And so the book is really, as I said, organized around those themes, while also kind of weaving my own story and the stories of my friends and friends I met online, while starting to pay attention to these things.
Yeah, and I also think that you describe in great detail the consequences of that unraveling in people's lives, and in many cases, the knock-on effects that has in the process of them coming to terms with feelings of trauma, feelings of religious injury. And you draw on a variety of scholars who are thinking about religious trauma, like Marlene Winnell, a former evangelical herself, who's a psychologist, and she talks about how evangelicalism to her communicates two core messages, mainly through its belief in original sin and its emphasis of a world defined by spiritual warfare. The first message is, you are not okay, and the second is, you are not safe. These messages get reinforced in religious and social contexts, and for parents who raise their children in this belief system, they can unintentionally expose children to a constant state of background anxiety about things like heaven, hell, sin, death, and the fate of the unsaved, some of whom are their own friends and family. As wider conversations and research around religious trauma develop, what forms of spiritual injury do you hope we might yet better understand?
Well, you just identified a lot of them. And, I don't have data on this, but in my own observation, in my own family, and I think from many people I've talked to, I think to come to faith, for people who came to, sort of an evangelical or fundamentalist faith on their own, I mean, certainly my parents, that was their story, the Jesus movement, the 1970s. And I think it was for a lot of boomers in that generation. It's one thing to sort of be at a place in your life where you feel these metaphors and stories and doctrines speak to your experience and your spiritual need, but to be a small child who has never, never really experienced the world and certainly has never committed some grave sin, to be told these messages with such intensity, I think for some people was really anxiety-inducing and hard to make sense of. And so, Marlene Winnell, who you mentioned, has been doing this work for a very long time and looking at the sort of psychological downside of religion, because there is also a big upside. I mean, there's a lot of research that suggests that the community in particular that religion can provide, the sense of meaning, purpose, that has positive psychological effects for many people. But I think Marlene and increasingly a large number of other therapists and mental health professionals are recognizing that it can come with a downside. I hope that research will help us better understand how that happens and why and what the mechanism is and what sort of makes the difference. But I think it's a positive sign that, more books are being written about this, more organizations are being created. I think even since I wrote the book, because really I was writing it 2 or 3 years ago because of the way publishing works, my sense is that there's even growing discussion around this topic, and I think that's positive.
You also describe how, as you mentioned earlier, evangelicalism has been extraordinarily successful at constructing a parallel universe of media, of education, of expertise, all of which helps to support its belief system. And as you note, this has been a pretty recent historical project, one formed largely from efforts to create private Christian schools and colleges, in part to maintain segregation in the post-Brown v. Board United States, for instance. What do you see as the most significant consequence of the parallel universe evangelicalism has constructed, both for those in the faith and beyond it?
Yeah, for this I owe a lot of debt to, a lot of scholars who have, historians, sociologists, pollsters, et cetera, who have written about some of the different pieces of this phenomenon, including Christian Kobes-Dumay and Robert Jones at the Public Religion Research Institute, who's also an author. They both have sort of dug into this and different pieces of this, but I think, what I've come to understand through my research, through their work and others, is that shift sort of tracks what evangelicals would see as sort of a decline of power, a loss of power, as the country was becoming more diverse, less Christian, less white, less traditional. There's the rise of the women's movement, of the LGBTQ movement, et cetera. We see a growing sort of demand for these institutions and structures. And, I think what they have enabled is a world in which it is possible to grow, and I know this firsthand, to grow up really isolated from other kinds of thinking. And, I think in a pluralistic society where our democracy necessitates talking across difference of identity, of race, of culture, in my opinion, that creates challenges as one sort of enters the real world. And I think it also contributes, I think pieces of that contribute to what we see today in terms of sort of an erosion of common understanding of reality and facts. I talk about this a little bit in my chapter on science. There's just the idea that I was taught, and not all evangelicals believe this, but I was taught, and many others like me were taught, that the world is 6,000 years old, that the Bible, the Genesis account is literally true. It should be treated almost like a science book. And even that scientists had sort of come up with this evolutionary theory because they didn't want to submit to God, because they wanted to sort of promote their own intellect over the truth of Scripture. And, this was one of the things that was a crack for me as I started to understand, not only that there was overwhelming consensus about this, but also that there were many, many religious people, including Christian people, who did accept evolutionary theory. But I think that kind of, again, it's not true of all evangelicals, but to the extent that it exists and that there is a real sort of resistance to and denial of any kind of secular knowledge, I do think it lays the groundwork for a skepticism toward any kind of shared reality and a real susceptibility to what you might call alternative facts.
Yeah, pushing further on that observation, I think, the forms of social critique that evangelicalism levels against society feel remarkably similar to ideas that have become popular across a wide range of political beliefs and alignments. There's a lack of trust in established institutions and experts. There's a desire for reform in our political and educational systems, a belief that traditional and social forms of media have both become unreliable, and also a profound desire to find like-minded individuals with whom we can build community and political will. Is it possible that, in some sense, we are all evangelical now?
I think in some ways it's become sort of the default religion of the country, and that goes back to your first question, because it is so hard to define, and it's, sort of evangelicalism has infused into so many Christian traditions in various ways. Churches that might have a mainline Protestant title in many ways are in their theology and practice much more evangelical and may even sort of de-emphasize their denominational affiliations. So, I think the sort of pervasiveness of evangelical thought in American society is hard to overstate and important to understand. At the same time, all the data suggests that religion, by and large, including evangelicalism, is on the decline. People are becoming less and less religious, less and less affiliated. The latest data suggests that might have leveled off a little bit, but overall, the biggest trend in religion the last several years has been a move away from religion. So I don't know what that means for evangelicalism or what it means for our politics, but the thing I think I can safely say is that it's a dynamic time. It's a time of change, and at least anecdotally, it seems to me that there's kind of an interaction between the politics and the religion. There's action and reaction. As the evangelical movement becomes more aligned with a political project, there are those who come into it and those who leave it, and I can't predict where that leads, but it's a fascinating time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for spending your time answering these questions. I appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.